right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to everyone for coming out. Very pleased to welcome everyone here, and pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Shireen Hunter, who has just published this book, the subject of our discussion today, Iran's Foreign Policy in the Post-Soviet Era, Resisting the New International Order. Now, Shireen has written, if I counted correctly, this is your 11th book?
Actually, no, altogether, if you include the edited volumes,
okay.
It's about 22.
Oh my, all right. All right, her 22nd book, counting edited volumes. But I have a particular interest in this one because 20 years ago, Shireen published this book, Iran and the World, Continuity in a Revolutionary Decade, which I found over the years to be this wonderfully rich and insightful and important, became really a kind of reference work for me on the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic during the first decade of the Islamic Republic's existence. And I've been waiting and waiting for a book to come out which would essentially extend the story, tell the story of the Islamic Republic's foreign policy, how it dealt with Europe, how it dealt with Japan, how it dealt with post-Soviet Russia, how it dealt with China and with rising powers in the so-called global South. All of these very, very important topics. And the book didn't appear. And so finally, Shireen, 20 years later, has taken it on herself to write the book that extends the story. And for anyone who is interested in, recognizes the importance of understanding Iranian foreign policy from the inside, not as people on the outside want to project that Iran's foreign policy must surely operate in certain ways. If you want to understand Iranian foreign policy from the inside and how certain calculations, certain trade-offs in all kinds of issue areas look from the perspective of Tehran, I really encourage you to read Shireen's work. Shireen is currently visiting fellow at the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. She also retains an appointment as a distinguished scholar at CSIS, where she worked for a number of years as director of CSIS's Islam program. She's held positions at the RAND Corporation, at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, at a number of other distinguished think tanks and research institutions. Before she became a scholar, though, she was actually a practicing Iranian diplomat. She served in the Iranian Foreign Ministry for 12 years. Between 1966 and 1978, served at the ministry and in overseas postings in London and Geneva. And I think you see that kind of inside experience reflected in her work on Iranian foreign policy. Shireen comes originally from Iran. She was educated at Tehran University, which for those of you who don't appreciate it is, I think I could say, kind of the Harvard of Iran. She was educated at Tehran University and then did graduate work at the London School of Economics and the Geneva Institute for International Studies, where she earned her PhD. I won't take up any more of your time. I think we should all listen to Shireen. I'm going to ask her to speak about the book, about what she thinks are some important themes and issues that should guide our understanding of Iranian foreign policy, and then we'll open it up to a discussion. And I have a feeling, given the topicality of the subject, we won't have a hard time generating a good conversation. So please join me in welcoming Shireen Hunter.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before saying a few words about the main themes of the book and why it took me so long to write the book, I'd like to thank Flynt, Leverett, and of course the New America Foundation for doing this, and really very much appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you coming here. I have been actually wanting to write this book for nearly 10 years because I always wanted to have a companion to the Iran and the world. But the problem was that, particularly when I worked at CSIS, now that I'm at a university, I don't have to do any fundraising. I had to do fundraising. And fundraising means that you have to do projects that the funders are willing. So I went into all kinds of places and published books, particularly on Islam. Hence my presence in Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. But I don't regret it because many of the things I did there helped prepare me for this. The book also tries, because for those of the people who haven't read Iran and the world or who haven't read other books about Iran's foreign policy before, tries to really put the current, or rather I would say that the conduct of Iran's foreign policy in the past 20 years or so within its historical context, and to bring out some fundamental themes and dilemmas that Iran has. To begin with, and more importantly, of course, I think that the main theme of the book essentially is that the collapse of the Soviet Union was probably, I would say that the second most important development, I mean, of course, the two world wars and so on and so forth, they are all very important. But in terms of their systemic consequences, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the second most important event in the history of, in my opinion, 20th century. The first one was the creation of the Soviet Union and the onset of the Cold War, because it went on for a very long time, and it really affected and dominated this Cold War paradigm and so on, international relations. And so obviously when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Third World ended, this had dramatic systemic consequences. Which I don't think that anybody has so far quite have really fathomed to how deep it was. And it also has meant that essentially we have right now, I mean, the early euphoria of a unipolar world or a benevolent U.S. hegemony and so on were just those euphoria and somewhat misplaced, but also, I don't want to get into that, but also the way certain things were handled, that unipolar moment, as somebody called it, didn't last as long. And so what we see really is happening. We are in a kind of a transition period in terms of the international system is concerned. It is not a multipolar system yet because there are still certain imbalances of power. Although towards the latter years of Cold War, it wasn't a completely bipolar world either. But it's not a unipolar world either. So what it has really happened is that the calculations on international relations level has become much more difficult. The interests have grown much more asymmetrical. One example I will just give you, it's all this problem issue, let's say, between U.S. and Turkey over Iran, the Iran deal. This would not have been the case, in a Cold War setting. And I can, later on go on, because I don't want to say, focus too much on this. I have limited time. I want to focus on Iran. Now, this systemic earthquake obviously had consequences for every country, frankly. But countries that were on the vicinity of the Soviet Union were affected by this much more. And I think that the country that probably, in my opinion, was most affected and in a most negative way was Iran. Partly because you have to keep in mind that Iran in the last 200 years, literally I would say that since the British envoy in 1804 or something went to Tehran to the Qajar court with the hope of having an alliance with Iran, and then they discovered that the Qajar kingdom is not what the Safavid kingdom was. They changed their policy, had actually lived in a bipolar context, characterized first by Russo-British and then later by U.S.-Soviet rivalry. So this had significant consequences for Iran. One of the things that was consequence for Iran was that its geopolitical advantage actually became a geopolitical negative liability. Because when you don't have any more the fear of a Soviet infiltration into Iran and through Iran into the Persian Gulf and whatever, the fact that Iran sits on this very, very valuable piece of property between the Persian Gulf and the Caspian Sea on the so-called oil belt, this actually makes the great powers wary of a country like that. And this is also one thing you have to remember, that the great powers don't like middle-range regional powers. This is a fact. It doesn't mean that it is anything good or bad, but this just simply is a fact. Great powers don't like middle-range powers. And so one of the consequences of the end of the Cold War and collapse of the Soviet Union was that Iran's geopolitical situation became a handicap. Iranian leadership, I think even up to today, has not understood how much their condition as a result of the end of Cold War has been eroded. So this is one of the themes that I focus on the thing. So the second theme that runs through the entire book is the fact that the Iranian foreign policy in the post-Cold War era has been incredibly inept. They have had defiance against those powers against whom they should not have been defiant, and basically have pursued what I call a concessionary policy vis-a-vis others, including all their neighbors, from Pakistan to even Turkmenistan and certainly the Gulf Arab countries, and to the almost level that at times they have been almost insulted and they haven't reacted to insults even. But part of this, again, is because of not realizing how the changes have happened and how the dynamics of this situation is. However, in addition to that, I think Iran has had a perennial problem, I would say, in part because, even historically even to go to the pre-Islamic Iran, Iran essentially is very lonely ethnically and linguistically and culturally. Iran doesn't have any natural friends and allies. No matter how much the Arab countries fight among themselves and so on, there is such a thing as an Arab League, or there is such a thing, some kind of Arab solidarity and so on. Essentially, Iran's neighbors are its historic antagonists. Arabs, of course, I would just, if you want me during conversation, I can give you an example, and the Turks. So the Iranians haven't understood this. The Iranian regime has tried to use Islam somehow to blunt this, Islamic Brotherhood and so on. But as I remember in some conferences, I used to meet some of these Iranians and I used to tell them, I said, look, no matter how much you talk about your Muslim brothers, for them, at least in the Arab world, you're going to remain Ajami and Rafidi, Persian and Shia. And so this is another thing. In the face of constant rebuff, the Iranians have continued this. Now, this is not an easy thing, because if, let's say, that the identity problem of Iran is very deep, the whole pole of Iran and Islam never have really reconciled, despite whatever people say, completely. Effort has been made, but never have been recognized. But the problem is that, as I argued in Iran and the world, some of Iran's problems didn't start with the Islamic regime. They had problems with the Shah as well. And, so Arabs didn't like Iran, whatever they did. Those days were because they were friend of Israel, did not support Palestinian. Now because they are sort of antagonistic towards Israel and to support Arabs. So there's nothing that this ajam can do that will please them. So in these circumstances, an Iranian diplomacy has to be much more alert and adept to this. Same thing goes on that I don't want to continue in this regard. So by and large, I think that I would say that Iranian foreign policy has been very inept. Iran has not realized to the extent to which the whole state of relationship with the U.S. has permeated all aspects of its relations globally. And this is not just with the, sanctions and so on became patently clear, but it was the case even before. Some of this, let's say, for instance, Iran has tried to have close relations with Russia without realizing that Russia, who still is a great power, or at least aspires to be a great power, doesn't want another strong middle power on its backyard. And also, therefore, Russian foreign policy is much more pragmatic when it comes towards the U.S. So the idea that Russia will have close relationship with Iran in order to confront the U.S. still is a kind of a Cold War hang-up that some of the Iranians, I think they are beginning to wake up, but it is too late. It's not that nobody said these things, they were, but, they didn't really quite penetrate the way it should be. The other thing that Iran, as I say, for example, the whole pipeline issues. It is true that Iran is and was and will be the most rational pipeline route for Central Asian and Caucasian energy. All companies agreed with this. I used to deal with this when I was in Brussels. But the problem is the Iranians didn't quite understand that this was not merely an economic issue. This was a strategic and political issue. And so they had to change completely their policies. The same thing with regard to their Arab neighbors, particularly in the Persian Gulf. The idea that Gulf Arabs who depend on their security would defy the United States and cooperate with Iran to an extent that would make U.S. unhappy shows an incredible lack of understanding of the dynamics of, international relations. So these are some of the things. Now, the biggest mistake also, what they made, in my opinion, is that regionally, basically, they have pursued the policy of status quo. Just about in every region, Iran has not been a revanchist government. Not in Persian Gulf, not in the post-Soviet space, quite the opposite. They have tried to maintain basically status quo and stability and so on. However, in one area that it counts, basically, they haven't done what it's needed. So all their good behavior in other parts has gone unnoticed. And that is, of course, in regard to relations with Israel and all these issues in Lebanon and so on, because nobody cares if Iran wants peace between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. That's a backwater thing, or, supports Georgia's territorial integrity. But they care about this particular issue. And so the idea that they can get any credit for this good behavior everywhere else while they are not changing their attitude there has been. The other thing is that they have done things very incrementally. They haven't been able to be very bold. And as a result, they have gotten the bad end of both end of the sticks in the bad end. For example, I give you an example. In 1991, the Persian Gulf War, the first Persian Gulf War, Iranian neutrality helped United States. This is a fact. People might dispute, but that's a fact. Iran could have made things more difficult. However, Iran did not understand that if they wanted something out of U.S., when U.S. was eager, everybody wanted to go to Tehran, they should have made the bold move. Join the alliance, establish relations with the United States. They didn't. And consequently, what happened is that after the U.S. won the war, what happened? Iran, we imposed the dual containment on Iran. Exactly, almost like a few months after, well, maybe a year officially after the end of the first Persian Gulf War, we had the dual containment on Iran. Everything they done incrementally, the Conoco deal, this and that, and they didn't realize they needed a bold action to break the lockdown. Now, when you read the book, if you read and go through everything, you will realize that maybe because of the systemic changes that had happened, whatever Iran did would not have been enough. That is very much could be the case, certainly after 1993. But even so, if they had acted in a certain bold way and had realized the importance of particularly the whole Arab-Israeli issue, the Israel connection, I think that they would have been able to do a lot more. For example, if not with U.S., they could have gone a longer way with the Russians, with the Chinese, with the Europeans even, but not doing it really boldly and openly. I think that they, as I said, they got the worst of the both worlds. The latest example was in Afghanistan. I cannot imagine a most inept action that Khatami is basically giving the store away. Why should not Rabbani government, which was recognized by United Nations as the government, and that was the Tajiks that were Iran's allies, and they brokered to have the Pashtuns back, and then the first thing they did was that Khalilzad started this anti-Iran campaign against Ismail Khan, and now Taliban are in Herat. So, you know what I'm saying? It's just not they haven't. This has been the most disastrous foreign policy. I think it's almost in the magnitude of disaster in the past 20 years, it comes almost to the worst time of the Qajar period. And that is to say a lot because Iranian foreign policy has never been very skillful. So the last point I want to make, and I will stop, is that why Iran has not been able to do this? Is it because there were nobody in Iran who would be able to see these things, or that simply there were some other issues and problems there? My first thing is that to some extent, again, I shouldn't be saying this because I was a member of the Iranian Foreign Service, but by now I would have been retired, hopefully, and maybe be more comfortable. But the point is, though, that the decimation of any, foreign policy cadre in Iran was amazing. I mean, there's really none of those, left, even middle-ranking, even the ones that came from, not all foreign ministry people were sons of aristocracy. I mean, there was a very great democratization had happened and so on. I don't want to get into that. So the degree of lack of knowledge of some of these people of international affairs is amazing. I don't want to personalize it, but there's one person who comes to my mind that later was at Harvard and so on and pontificates now, writes articles everywhere and so on. When I first met him, he didn't know anything. They have developed a sort of on-the-job training, but in a very, very superficial level. It's like all their philosophers as well. Jürgen Habermas apparently said, I have never seen any country in the world so preoccupied with misunderstood notions of Western philosophers as Iran, which is correct. So I have seen how some of them grew, but by the time that they grew and understood a bit more, then the time was wrong. But there is also goes somewhat much more deeper certain things in the Iranian thing, why they haven't been able to change. Part of it is that even though in actuality Iran has acted in many respects pragmatically, maybe too much at some levels, but the fact of the matter is that the regime is an ideological regime. Is an ideological regime in a sense that the legitimacy of the regime is based on some kind of ideology, which is, in regard to foreign policy, which is a compilation of or combination of Islam, militant third worldism, and the sort of the left-leaning aspects of the past. So, for instance, all this issue regarding Israel and so on, I think it's much less to do with Islam than it has to do with the remnants of. So don't forget that these people were, some of them basically were trained in the PLO camps, where most of them, including reformists, this is another surprise you may have, most of the reformists actually have a far more leftist background. Not just themselves were leftists, but their fathers were leftists. So, we can go into that. So, but the problem of an ideological state is that if anything you do that, undermines that ideology, it undermines your legitimacy. And this is where has been the Achilles heel of the regime, that they haven't been able to really take those bold actions that had been needed to be taken. And of course, there are other reasons that I can't go into that right now, internal regime differences and competition for power and so on. But I think we should not underestimate this. But the problem also has been that because of the post-Soviet international situation, organization, the outside world's willingness to accommodate them has also not been there, which in my opinion has not been correct, but I'm not here, to advocate anything, I'm just here to explain. So that's for people themselves to decide. And so in a way, therefore, what I think is that now I think the Iranian behavior in the past, and it is not support for terrorism and so on and so forth. Frankly, if you really look at the places that terrorism has come, Pakistan, look at what Pakistan has been doing with U.S. money funding the Taliban. This is nothing new. I wrote in 1989 that U.S. and Pakistan interests don't coincide in Afghanistan. So we have had our own ideological kind of straitjacket in terms of dealing with Iran. But, U.S. is a big power. Smaller powers like Iran have to. So at the moment, then, Iran has really reached a situation that just about, everywhere, what they call it, the news has tightened. The idea that even Turkmenistan treats Iran like they were, it's amazing. So let me just say, so if you want to see, this book is a little bit, was not pleasant to write, because you get, in any way in a post-Soviet world, Iran would have had problems, because Iran's strategic position and its, frankly, power potential makes it something that local powers and international powers don't want to see, even if under the best of circumstances. Even if you had, but under these circumstances, therefore, you need a diplomacy which is far more alert and is far more, skillful, and this hasn't been the case. Sorry.
Wow. Thank you very, very much. I'm going to take the prerogative as the moderator and ask the first question.
Please do.
I have at least 4 in mind after listening to you, but I'll pick one. I wanted to pick up on a point that you made and I think it's absolutely right, in the Persian Gulf, in Central Asia, the post-Soviet space, Iran has in no way, certainly not for the last 20 years, it has in no way been anything but a status quo power. But you say, in the case of the Arab-Israeli arena, that a position of resistance to Israel has not served Iran well, because that's the conflict that matters to the United States.
Right.
Let me push back on that just a little bit and see what you say. If, as you said toward the end of your remarks, the United States, other important powers, particularly in the West, may not in the end have been really willing to accommodate an Islamic Republic of Iran. And certainly I think in Tehran today, that is, at best an open question, whether the United States is really prepared to live with an Islamic Republic.
They think they're not, but that's...
Yeah. If you're uncertain about that and think that the answer might at the end be no, that actually supporting the cause of resistance to Israel has served Iran well because it has not assuaged the concerns about Arab elites, about the Ajam, as you say.
They never will be assuaged.
But it has, polls would suggest that in recent years it has made a dent on mass opinion in the Arab world, to a point where I would think that in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, in other countries, I think these governments would have to be very wary of lending their direct support to, say, U.S. military action against Iran because of their concern about a popular backlash. And in that sense, resistance has actually done some useful thing. Not aside from the ideological dimension, it has, in sort of interest-based terms, it has done some useful things for Iran.
Well, I think that, that is something that, frankly, I'm not saying that, there is some element, but I personally don't think so. Because the unwillingness to do things vis-a-vis Iran became really established after 93. This is something people don't understand. They think it was the Bush that started regime change. It was the dual containment that started the regime change, and it goes way, way back. However, there were times that there were a lot of euphoria over, for instance, what Rafsanjani would be able to do. And I think that if he had been able at that time to be much bolder and say, two-state solution openly and recognize the existence of Israel, doesn't mean that to get and establish relations or anything. I think that would have made a tremendous difference. Absolutely tremendous difference. And to be honest with you, I think that Iran, the latest polls, I don't know whether it's correct or not, shows that particularly places like Egypt, Morocco, and so on, a lot of the Arab population would allow Iran to be. And look the way people are reacting to even Erdogan, because he is Sunni. But unfortunately, the Arab-Ajam thing goes very deep. I think it goes deeper, frankly, for Arabs than it does for Ajam, but it still is there. Now, I don't think that the Saudis and others are worried about the Arab opinion in, for instance, in Morocco or Egypt or whatever. They worry a bit about their own, maybe, Shia population. And of course, places like Kuwait and so on, they have even Iranian. I mean, not all, but most of the Kuwaiti Shias are of Iranian origin. Not all of them are, a lot of them just are very close to the royal family and all that. But the point is that I think this really has damaged Iran. And I think that essentially, I think, in my opinion, Iran has been the only country that has pursued literally has pursued an Islamic foreign policy instead of a national foreign policy. I have been arguing for this, that national foreign policy. To be honest, I have to tell you, for me, Iran is more important than Islam. That is for sure. That is for me that I declare my colors. But having said that, even if you wanted advanced Islam, the Iranian foreign policy has not helped the cause of Islam. And I think that they really have gotten the worst of the both worlds. And I think that this is just very upsetting to see that, all and sundry, and everybody has played the Iran card. What I will suggest, if I may be so bold and if I may be forgiven for my presumption, is that Americans have done the same thing. That because of not wanting to deal with Iran, they have been basically paid Pakistan more than they deserve. They have done all sorts of things. The Russians, they gave the Russians what the Russians want, just to get a crummy resolution, and so on and so forth, and have tried to, bring the oil from the thing from here to there. They created the Taliban to contain Iran. I can go on and on and on. So in a way, it's a sort of almost reflections of one another. But I think the biggest mistake it just doesn't stand to reason to think that, and sometimes now it really has reached a level that when you read sometimes the Iranian websites and others about Iran's situation in the world and so on, it almost looks like it makes me almost go crazy because it has so little resemblance to what is out in the reality. And you know we are having economic relations with Cameroon and Ghana and Comore Islands and so on, and how you're going and spending money on this. Now, even if you wanted, I am a third worldist in many ways myself. I think the international system is rotten through and through. But the point is that if you want to be a player, even in the reform agenda, you have to somewhat recognize the system and then to say we want to, to improve it by, basically exhortation has taken the place of diplomacy and foreign policy for the Iranian thing. Now, here I think it is because you see what happened to the Soviet Union. I'm not saying this will happen to Iran because it's different circumstances and different things. But the fact was that Gorbachev could not sell its new thinking because the new thinking was undermining the position of certain groups. Mm-hmm. But I think that what the people that I do hold more responsible than anything else, frankly, are today's so-called reformists. Because these are the ones that basically sabotage Rafsanjani's policy. So almost like until 1997, Behzad Nabavi was talking against relations with the U.S. And all this Khomeini-ha and all these people that are not liberal and Democrat and they want to do these things, they all, and so consequently and then of course when the whole, by creating a linkage between Iran, the shape of Iranian regime and its foreign policy, and trying to bring in outsiders into Iran's domestic debate, they have made any move on foreign policy even more difficult. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is something people don't remember, that the first person that criticized when Ahmadinejad agreed to swap deal was Karoubi. That you sold the thing. So this is why that, we haven't, I think that the way I say about the illiteracy of the Iranian foreign policy elite about Iran, but about the world, I will not use the word illiteracy, but I think that there's a lot of simplistic way of looking at Iran also in the U.S. and so on. Now, the one other thing, Flynt, that with what Iran could have done, by saying that we recognize the state of Israel, but we also think the Palestinians should have basically the 242 position of the UN, then nobody, the Chinese, Russians, nobody would have listened to Americans in terms of economic relations with Iran and, other things. And look at Erdogan. Erdogan, insults Shimon Peres, and still nobody, until recently, there's nothing. And he is a hero. And the Iranians are still subversive Ajamis and so forth. Okay,
let's open it up to the floor so we can expand the discussion here. Anybody have a question, comment? Let's see. Yes, let's go back here, please.
I have a.
And please identify yourself.
Gareth Porter, Porter, Interpress Service. I have a question about the Iranian nuclear program. And it has to do with the alleged studies documents. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to ask both of you to comment on what you know or think you know about the provenance and the authenticity or lack of such of those documents. Of course, I'm particularly interested in Flynt, having been in the intelligence community, hoping you might have some observations that would be relevant in that.
Okay. Shireen?
Well, I recuse myself because I don't know anything about the provenance. I just deal with stuff on the open sources, including Gareth Porter's articles sometimes. But so I will leave Flynt that might have some insight in this to answer this question.
Yeah, most of this stuff came up after I left government, so I'm basically relying on open source, unclassified information, just like everybody else. My sense is that the alleged studies in that this problem originated not exclusively but primarily as a result of what has sometimes been colloquially described as the laptop of death. Basically a laptop computer which was supposedly, according to various press reports, passed by an Iranian who wanted asylum of some sort, passed to German intelligence, and then somehow it made its way to U.S. intelligence. And this laptop supposedly contained files which suggested that the Iranians might have been working on various sorts of design and engineering problems which really would only have applicability in the context of a nuclear weapons program. Uranium enrichment, yes, you could use it to produce weapons-grade fissile material, but you can do a whole lot of other things short of that, which are perfectly legitimate. But according to this laptop of death, and I guess there was some other intelligence information, I'm not really sure what, but other intelligence information which led American intelligence, some other Western intelligence services to raise rather leading questions about whether Iran was engaged in certain specific kinds of activities. Some of this information got passed on to the IAEA so that it could try and check this stuff out in the course of its inspections, monitoring activities in Iran. I think that the agency has tried to engage in a dialogue with the Iranians about these issues. They described this in their various reports in recent years. And what I gather is that it's kind of bogged down to the agency says, well, national governments have told us you may be doing these things, and the Iranians say we're not, and can you actually provide us with some information to back any of this up? The IAEA hasn't until recently been able to provide any of that information. Finally, I guess it was the U.S. allowed the IAEA to present, a small amount of whatever information it had available, but the Iranians, sort of denied that it was true, and the agency and the Iranian government remain at something of an impasse on this. That's my understanding.
A couple of things about the current story about the origin of the laptop documents, just published in Der Spiegel this past week, about a week ago. One point is that the alleged person who collected the documents was an Iranian businessman who was recruited by German intelligence as a spy.
Okay.
Was providing information to German intelligence officials when he traveled abroad during a period of years, supposedly gained access to these documents because he had contracts to pour concrete and do other construction-related activities for the Iranian government in places like Isfahan and Natanz.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow gained access to these top-secret documents. And then the second point is that when he was discovered, he passed on the laptop documents, or before he was discovered, passed on the laptop documents to his wife, who then smuggled them out, and that the idea was that this was a life insurance policy. My question really is whether this is a plausible story from your understanding of the way intelligence spies would work.
It's certainly plausible in the sense that, after the pre-Iraq War, the fiasco about Iraqi WMD pre-2003, given the kinds of stuff that people got away with and that people in the U.S. and other intelligence services were willing to buy onto, I'm prepared to believe almost any story of how, information can be generated about, a suspect WMD program is plausible. I mean, in other words, I'm past the point where I would say, oh, that couldn't be, the CIA would never attach any plausibility to that. I'm just past that point. So it's certainly plausible to me that something like that could have happened. Now, how good is the information? Some press reports on these documents say that there have been problems found in them, and that now, as the U.S. tries to build a case that there's an Iranian nuclear weapons program, they're relying on other streams of information, including, here's another shades of Iraq, defectors. Okay? There are supposedly 3 defectors whose information is feeding into what's going to be a new national intelligence estimate coming out on Iranian WMD. One of them has actually been described. U.S. officials have been quoted on background describing this guy in the press as they're really pleased with this guy. He is a nuclear physicist who has, for more than 10 years, worked at the highest levels of Iran's nuclear program, and really has the goods on what's going on. The problem is that the guy is 32 years old now. At the time he would have presumably defected to the United States, he was 31. Unless he finished his PhD when he was like 19 and went to work for the nuclear program, working in these incredibly compartmented, highly classified and restricted parts of the program, I'm just not really sure how that works out. But, we believe stuff that was even more outlandish from Iraqi defectors, including the, wonderfully codenamed Curveball.
Flynt, can I just add one thing in general in terms of trying to figure out, and again, I am agnostic on these things because I don't have the information, is that the whole nuclear issue has also become very much enmeshed with Iran's internal power struggle. In addition to this, if there was a time when there was Hossein Mousavian, who used to be the Iran's ambassador to Germany, and who was also worked with Rouhani. After the things were, he was accused of espionage and so on, but they didn't put him in jail and so on. They just quieted down. But it's also conceivable that the Iranian, warring factions sometimes manufacture things. And to give it, because, there is people that want to have Iran to be militarily attacked. And so this is obviously we know about the Mujahideen and so on, but there will be others as well. So it's not so difficult, particularly these days, to also fabricate. That doesn't mean that it may not also be true. But, there's also a lot of manufacturing going on, both inside and out.
Yes, let's go over here, please. This gentleman, blue tie.
Sean Haravi, International Center for Terrorism Studies at the Potomac Institute and Penn State University. My question is for both of you. Can you describe or comment on Iran's interest in state support for terrorism in reference to Hezbollah or other terrorist networks?
Well, I think that, the whole Hezbollah question is because, I find the whole issue of the terrorist networks, I think you need to clarify that. The greatest terrorist network is Al-Qaeda. And I find it very difficult, that Iran supports Al-Qaeda, to be honestly. I think it's just that there's no evidence, although everybody says bin Laden is hiding in northern Iran or this and this. That's what, as far as Hezbollah is concerned, that is the big conundrum. And I know this is blasphemy, I might be excommunicated, but the whole idea of whether Hezbollah is actually a terrorist group or not is up for grabs. So this is all I have to say. But the problem is that when we say Iran sponsored terrorism, they haven't supported IRA or PKK or whatever, there are all kinds of, FARC and this and this and that. So there's so much out there. But so the support for terrorism has become essentially a euphemism for Iran's, again, policy towards the Arab-Israeli conflict and the whole Israel-Iran relation. And this is where Hamas and Hezbollah comes into being. And the whole idea also, Hamas being just the handmaiden of Iran, I think it's, again, even Economist, who is not exactly known for its liberalism, wrote this some time ago.
Except in the 18th century.
No, the other thing, Hamas has said that the only country that is qualified to mediate between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority is Egypt. This to begin with. This is where Arab Ajam comes into being. The second thing is that after the January 2006 election, when they won, the first place where do you think that Khalid Mash'al first went? Guesses? Tehran, Damascus, or some other third place? I'm sorry? Who said?
Saudi, no?
Yes, Riyadh. He went to Riyadh. I mean, that is the whole money and all these other things. But the problem is that, you see, the whole thing that has developed, Iran has developed its own constraints that they cannot come out of this. A colleague of mine from France some time ago wrote a book. He wrote it. Olivier Roy got most of the credit, but he wrote it. You see Farhad Khosrokhavar writing it. And the title of the book is Comment sortir d'une révolution islamique. You can say this to about any revolution. How to get out of an Islamic revolution. But it's also for us how to get out of our Iran habit. This has become like a drug. How do we get out of Iran habit? How can we find a paradigm that would justify the whole set of policies from Afghanistan to the Caucasus if we don't have this demon of Iran, which is excessively said is, powerful and so on and so forth, is threatening Europe with missiles and is an existential threat to humanity. And so I think that this is the context within which we have to, the way I look at it, and I may be wrong. And I know that a lot of people would, as I say, excommunicate me.
Well, I will associate myself with your heresy on this one. I think Shireen drew an important distinction that there are, even more narrowly defined than Sunni groups, there are, extreme Salafi groups like Al-Qaeda that the Islamic Republic considers, and I think with quite good reason, as a major threat to their interests.
Lashkar Tayyibi or Sepah Muhammad, all this Jundullah, Abdul Malik Rigi, and all that.
And I think that there's no real evidence that Iran is supporting these groups and has in fact cooperated in important ways with the United States at times and with other countries in trying to contain the threat that's posed by those groups. Then you get into a group like Hamas, which, while Sunni, basically, distinguishes itself from, extreme Salafi groups like Al-Qaeda by their emphasis on what they would describe as a political agenda, that they say they don't engage in terrorism, they engage in armed resistance, and armed resistance is not an end in itself, it is a means to a political end. And it's a political end which Iran supports in various ways. And I think the reality is, in the Palestinian context, that Hamas has now become this unavoidable political player on the Palestinian side. You cannot do a deal to reach a two-state solution without Hamas buying into that, and without Hamas having an important political role in a Palestinian state. And in fact, at this point, Hamas, Mishal has said this publicly many, many times. He is prepared to live with a two-state solution along 1967 lines. With Hezbollah, I mean, there you have a Shia connection between the Islamic Republic and Hezbollah. Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, is the official marja for Hezbollah. But you also have, an important political agenda there. And again, I think Hezbollah at this point, it's not just that it is this, armed militia, paramilitary group. It is now, I think the single most important political party in Lebanese politics. And I think Lebanese politics is basically split down the middle between the March 8 coalition and the March 14 coalition. And I think it's really, foolish and short-sighted in the extreme, to let, kind of rigid definitions of terrorism put your policy in a position where you can't deal with political reality. And I think that's what we've done with regard to both Hamas and Hezbollah. And I think we've also use the terrorism issue to use Shireen's phrase, to feed our Iran habit. It's not a rational way to approach foreign policy, I don't think. Yes, sir.
Hi, Colonel Dick Class, U.S. Air Force retired. I wonder if you could comment on how Iran has played their Iraq card since 2003 and what you see them doing in Iraq from now on as the U.S. troops get gradually withdrawn.
I would again submit that they have played the Iraq card dumbly and stupidly and played into the hands of United States. Essentially, one of the things that you look at what even the Iraqis have been saying, some of the things, including who was the Sunni guy who was in Ayad Alawi's time, he was defense minister. He said early on, Iraq's greatest enemy is Iran. They have, even today, they have electricity problem. They blame Iranians for their electricity problem. This is amazing. Well, basically, insurgency in Iraq was run. First of all, let me tell you, in 2003, when first Khatami went to Baghdad, or to Iraq, or wherever it was, Najaf or so on, I can't remember exactly. But anyway, went to Iraq, he said U.S. has two choices. At that time, he still was president, either a reformist and progressive Islam or the Islam of Taliban. And of course, one of the first things was that the way Iran, I guess, because of other policies, the U.S. basically didn't want to deal with Abdulaziz Hakim's coalition. Because, of the Iran connection. So they went with Al-Dawa, which was anti-Hakim, and so when Jafari became, and then when Jafari started cooperating with Iran, we'd say we don't like him, and we brought in Nouri al-Maliki. Anyway, so Iran actually has mishandled the whole Iraq thing as well. They have helped them very much, whether it is electricity. Obviously, they sell them things, but nevertheless, this is going from Iran to them, foodstuff and other things and so on. They have built things in there. And they have gotten basically the wrong end of the stick. The other thing is that we kept constantly accusing Iran of creating mischief. The Mahdi army, actually, initially, Muqtada Assad was anti-Iran. Almost even up until a year ago when he went to Syria, Muqtada Assad, he said some anti-Iran stuff. Then, of course, who has been funding the insurgency in Iraq? The insurgency in Iraq has been funded by the Saudis. This is, again, an open secret. And the foot soldiers come from Arab countries transiting through Syria. But from General Petraeus to Odierno and everybody, we can't, as I said, our Iran habit, we say Iran is destabilizing Iraq. So they have mishandled Iraq as well. Again, by not realizing that they cannot have, any presence in Iraq if they don't have a reasonable relations with the United States. this is not saying U.S. is good, Iran is bad, U.S. is good. This is just as an analyst of foreign affairs in the international system. You have to understand that U.S. is a key player, is a player internationally on different front and different countries. And for Iran to think that they can compete with U.S., it is a stupid thing to do. So because of lack of realizing this fundamental importance of U.S., I think that they have, again, in Iraq as well, mishandled. And for example, one of the issues that is, if you read the Iranian press the way I do every day, one of the things that is very much upsetting Iranians is that Iraq has been giving, apparently, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, war reparations to Kuwait, but not a single penny to Iran. They are claiming the Iranian oil fields as ours. The Turks attack Kurds in northern Iraq. This is not called the invasion, or the Iranians kill one Peshak member in northern Kurdistan. So they have basically mishandled it as well. Again, not realizing that, because for us, changing Iran has become the paramount objective. So even if, for example, what our so-called allies are doing in Iraq is undermining our policy there, that's okay. Whether it is Pakistan in Afghanistan, but it's not just Pakistan, or it is that the Saudis are running their own agenda in, for Persian Gulf supremacy in Iraq. So no, in Iraq as well, they have basically mishandled it, because remember that the first year and a half, still Khatami presidency was there, and then they wanted to talk to us, essentially, and Mottaki several times said that anytime U.S. is willing to elevate the level of representation to talk, but Secretary Rice at the time said, no, we don't want it. And of course, when Khalilzad was ambassador there, I don't want to get into that what happened then. So,
Shireen, let me follow up on that.
Please.
I'm interested. I mean, you take a very critical view of Iranian policy in Iraq, but if you think, let me put the question to you this way: given where Iran is vis-a-vis Iraq today. Where the United States is vis-a-vis Iraq today, if you project forward 5 years, who's going to have more political influence in Iraq?
I think still U.S., Europe, because, the thing is, let's see first of all, I come back to this Arab-Ajam issue. All you have to do is you look at the history of Islam. In the history of Islamic world, ethnicity has always trumped religion. So even the Shia Arabs, already they say, Iraqi Shia say that, these Iranians are crazy because they do this thing, we don't do that, they have this, we don't have this, and so on and so forth. Secondly, governmental competition. Nouri Maliki is anti-Iran. And Jafari even was, but but Jafari was not as bad as Nouri al-Maliki, and now let's not talk even about Iyad Alawi and all the other Sunnis and so on and so forth. So I think that this is one element, that Iran cannot do that. This is one of those. For Iraq is also, Ajam Iraq is going to be more important than Shia. This is one thing. The other thing is that states are basically competitive. The fact that Iraq sees itself as an important player in the Persian Gulf. They don't think that, the fact that the Shias may have some say doesn't mean that the state ambition is going to disappear. They're still going to be competitive. The idea that Iraq is going to be a Katba of Iran is ridiculous. The reason Prince Turki says that Americans gave Iran in a golden platter to Iran is because he wants that to be given to them, not to leave Iraq independent. So this is another thing. But the third thing is Iraq is going to need investment. Who is going to do the investing in there? Secondly, U.S. is going to be, unless God forbid some calamity befall us, which I hope never happens, U.S. is going to be present in the Persian Gulf. And notwithstanding our exaggeration of Iranian military, as somebody says, we can just bomb the hell out of them, in 2 days. Basically, look, the current Iranian army, given the change in the technology, is even worse than Reza Shah's army when the Allied powers came and walked basically through Iran. So Iran has always been in a bad case. The West has never treated Iran fairly. The way that we have forgiven and forgotten things that, for example, I would say it because somebody has to say it. The Turkish generals in 1980s, they said that the number, this is Amnesty International, and I quote and I give you all the footnote. Nothing I say is not footnoted. Nothing. There's no speculation, so some secret source told me. No, it's all up. That they had close to 100,000 politicals, that all of them were tortured. But there was no brouhaha about Turkish generals and so on and so forth. The Saudis, if we like so much freedom and human rights, why don't we say how even not the 12 Shiras, how the Ismailis are treated in Najran, in Saudi Arabia. So this is it. So I don't know. Maybe it goes to the Greeks and the Persians, or the Greeks and the Romans. Maybe Persia is the antithesis of the West or something. I don't know. Whatever it is, I have found it historically interesting that this attitude, towards Iran. Since I was there and I was following all these things, the whole talk in U.S. Congress about arms sales to Iran during the Shah, when he was doing, I will admit that the Shah's rhetoric did not please the Americans. You can do whatever you want with Americans as long as you say, yes, sir, no, sir, we are your friends. Like the Pakistanis. They come here, they say a few things, and they go do whatever they want to do. But if the Shah say, I want to be your ally, not your client, I am descendant of Cyrus and this and that, then we can't handle that. Appetite borders, we can't handle it. And this is basically a psychological problem here as well. And of course, those Iranians who want us to bring them back to power are not going to say this. So that's what it is.
Yeah, uppity third world. I think, some of our Brazilian and Turkish friends would have some things to say about that too. Yes, let's go to the back here, please.
Fagbosh Fatemi, Oxford Charter Group. Thank you for your presentation. Let me try something as briefly as I can, because I think there's a different narrative to ineptness that you proclaim in terms of Iran's foreign policy. And I think that narrative comes out of the long experience with the Western world, starting with the 1906 revolution up till when Mohammad Mossadegh and Hossein Fatemi was foreign minister, and when they said neither east nor west, and it was a nationalist foreign policy, and they weren't allowed to govern, and the overthrow of that, and then if you fast forwarded through the years of the hated Pahlavi regime, and then on to the Iran-Iraq war, when Iran had to go by itself all alone. So it's a foreign policy that basically says, I don't give a damn what you think. We're going to do what we want.
No, but you see, that is
just for the sake of a different narrative, I'm not arguing with you. I agree with some of your points.
No.
But the thing is, their attitude is that we survived the Iran-Iraq war, and the people who are in control are the people who survived that. And they say, we can go it alone, and we don't need anybody else, and that's the way they're proceeding. Now, it may be right or wrong, but for them, fitting their ideology, at the moment it's right.
I don't think it is quite, I would go 100%.
But let me just finish. One more
I'm
comment.
sorry. I thought you were
that's okay.
finished.
Just one more comment,
go ahead,
because
please,
I want to hear your views.
No, of course, please go ahead.
And given the incredible concentration of stupidity about Iran and Iran policy in this town that hasn't changed, what else can they do? How do you change it? How do you change the mindset that considers Iran as being the enemy in everything?
No. If I may,
yes,
do you want to? Okay. If you have finish your comments, which I appreciate actually, but if I may say so. You see, the sign of a good foreign policy is, to begin with, I am, again, a little bit different from, I think the whole Mossadegh era has been mythologized. And the reason I'm saying this, I'm older than you, and I actually was a child during the Mossadegh era. And I think this is one thing. Mossadegh had one of the most inept foreign policies of, that matches the ineptness of this and unrealism of Mossadegh. Again, we will do whatever we want, no matter what. That's what left to the event that transpired later. So I don't want to get into that because that's raking too much things. The point is, the fact of the matter is that the difference in power counts in international relations. And it depends also what your values are. What is what is the good that you want to achieve? The idea that Iran will commit suicide in some ways, almost which they have, simply because we want to do whatever we want to do. I don't think this is something that any government can or should do. Now, how could Iran have unfrozen this situation? There were several occasions. I will say it and I will say it again. The only way Iran can change this is to change its attitude towards the state of Israel. There's nothing they can do as long as this particular thing hasn't solved. Europe will not do it, and so they could do it. They could come out and declare two-state solution. They have gone out of their way to create difficulties. I think Israeli policy towards Iran is not correct in terms of their own long-term interests. But having said that, after all, when Ahmadinejad goes and denies the Holocaust, this is not required by an independent foreign policy. You see what I'm trying to say? So I think that, difference of power is something that the Iranians have to recognize. They cannot, this is why I'm saying resisting the international system, they cannot single-handedly change. Nobody can. Even the Roman Empire couldn't, dominate the entire world. In fact, Caesar, as the height of Rome's thing, says that we still have in the east the Persian Empire and in the west the German barbarians. Mm-hmm. So when the United States cannot mold the world according to its own desire, how can Iran do this? And so this is where my thing is. It's not a question whether West has been fair or unfair. In interstate relations, issues of fairness doesn't obtain. Every country is responsible for its own well-being. And so this is where I think that I take issue. That's why I think also that Mossadegh's, policy also was naive at best, inept and catastrophic at worst. Because the idea that Mossadegh thought that the United States is going to support nationalization of oil, it was naive. It showed he was stupid. Mossadegh has been made into something people don't understand. And he couldn't handle the two-day. He couldn't handle the clergy. And, the only thing that... And now you can't talk about anything else because the whole so-called Iranian heroes are people that we cannot discuss them as historical figures because they have acquired the aura of myth, whether it is the Constitutional Revolution heroes or not.
Shireen, let me ask you on that point. Do you think fundamentally, does the Islamic Republic adopt this posture of resistance toward Israel? Do you think it does this primarily on ideological grounds, or does it do it because, particularly in a post-Cold War environment, that Israel itself has become a kind of potential regional hegemon? And that, apart from any ideological issue, there is a basic geopolitical issue that needs to be addressed of how does Iran secure its place in a region in which there is Israel backed by the lone superpower that could be seen as aspiring to a kind of regional hegemony.
Absolutely. I think there is an element of that, certainly to the Israeli policy towards Iran. Because you have to understand that Israeli policy towards Iran changed during the Shah.
Yeah.
This is something people don't seem to understand. It's only when the Iranian Revolution took a wrong turn that people became nostalgic about the Shah. There's a very interesting book, actually, which I recommend people to read it. It actually is Israel and Khomeini. It's a very interesting thing. So there is that geopolitical context. That's why also the whole Turkey issue. Because these are major powers. You see, Egypt is out of equation. Egypt is in a kind of a coma. Egypt is in a national coma, so they are out of equation. Arabs are out of equation. So the contending powers are Turkey and Iran. So this obviously is going to create competition. However, you can conduct geopolitical competition without making yourself vulnerable to the kind of things that now I think that because the way they have frightened the Israelis, and I don't think that everything they say is just that they are also frightened. I mean, I give this, that Israel has a security issue. I'm not an anti-Israeli person. I'm not the kind of visceral anti-Israeli. No, not at all. I have a lot of sympathy, actually, for the state of Israel, for the people of Israel. So they have fear as well. So the point is, you can have geopolitical competition, but you don't have to go as far as to make yourself irrelevant, basically, in this competition. I mean, what interest in common Iran has with Syria? I will even go further to say that I know this is a heresy. I will still think that Iran's natural ally in the Middle East is the state of Israel. So this is one of the tragedies of this Islamic Republic that has made it enemy of the Jews, who were historically friends of the Persians. And if in the Arab eyes, they still think that they are dealing secretly or something. So I think that the way they have mishandled it, a lot of it is ideological. Why? Ayatollah Khamenei, I will risk my salvation on this, that he really actually is not a good Muslim. I know this from good thing that he used to play the fiddle, and probably he also drank. He definitely loved poetry and stuff like that. He is a leftist. He's one of those leftist things. He was part of the member of the God-worshipping socialists in the 40s and so on and so forth. And he is that is why that he has internalized the left's famous unholy trinity. Imperialism, international Zionism, and Arab reaction. I call this the unholy trinity. He has internalized this. They are living in a time warp of the late 60s and early 70s. This is one element. The other element is that ideologically, they have to have a cause. There's no more cause left. Communism is gone, so this has become for them. The same way also to some degree for Israel as well. They almost, in this very perverse kind of self-destructive thing, they almost have become necessity. In fact, my friend David Menarshi, who is himself of Iranian descent, said it. I was reading it in some of the website. It was published, I don't know, Jerusalem Post or some other place or something, in an interview. David Menarshi said that they have become obsessed with one another. And he was critical, obviously, of both sides. So I think that this is the problem. But ultimately, to me, the issue comes to the issue of legitimacy. Mm-hmm. If it wasn't for Islam and for this, that the poster child of Islam has become Palestine, yeah. Why would Iran needs to have a wali faqih? Why not? The kings, at least, we had for 3,000 years, and they never were as intrusive. Even they hated Pahlavis. In the worst time, they never did anything similar to what these people have done in terms of, intrusion in people's lives. You see what I'm saying? Because you could do whatever you wanted, at least in your house. You were not capable of politically expressing yourself, but basically in your house, you want to drink, music, whatever you want to do, go ahead and do it. So this has become the raison d'etre in some ways. Otherwise, for instance, the way they fight over women's headscarf. And they don't know that they are basically self-destructing. This is a problem. They haven't learned anything from Soviet Union, that the atheistic propaganda actually helped religion. And the more they create Quran reading schools, the more people become faithless. They just don't seem to realize that the power identification of religion and power is actually undermines, religion. So they are upset because Iranians, one of the famous things that people were shouting, which I believe I have always argued, including in Iranian newspapers, for a nationalistic foreign policy for Iran, where Iran's national interests are put ahead of whatever ideological thing. And the people in Iran were saying, na Gazze, na Lebanon, janam fadai Iran. Which is essentially says we don't have anything to do with Gaza or Lebanon. Not that one shouldn't be sympathetic for plight of anybody anywhere, but that not to do it to the point of that becomes, self-destructive, suicidal. This is where I think that ideology, both the personal things of leaders, but also more importantly, because their raison d'être is this. Islam.
Let's take one more question. Let's come to this
sorry.
gentleman here, please.
Hossein Ibn Yusuf, International Petroleum Enterprises, and I too thank you for the wonderful presentation. I do agree with you on a number of points. The cost that the U.S. is accepting for an attempt to isolate Iran is getting really expensive. Iran's insistence to emphasize on that Israeli issue that you mentioned, the impact that you mentioned of the fall of the Soviet Union and so on. But that's basically it. Beyond that, your point on Afghanistan, if what you said about Iran's position in Israel and whatever Iran does is not going to make any difference, that would be also the case for Afghanistan. On the pipeline issue, I honestly don't think that that really has been hurting Iran because Iran is a producer and exporter. So it was an economic issue, and later on Iran used it as a political issue as well. It's hurting Central Asia and the Caucasus to actually try to export their oil to Asia through that long route that you mentioned.
But it is not Iran who doesn't let them to go through Iran. It's the U.S. that doesn't want it to go through
That
Iran.
is true, but it's because of Iran's insistence on certain issues that is causing...
Now you are wanting Iran to be even more selfless behavior that I would admit.
No, let me that was just one of the points,
Right.
and I'll be more than happy to discuss it. This is something
it's
that
okay.
I've researched considerably.
Right.
On you mentioned and you suggested that Iran should accept the two-state solution. I honestly think that Iran has done better. What Iran has done is, and said it so many times, is that let's leave it to the Palestinians to decide. That's a much more democratic...
Yeah, but that is a code word. I'm sorry if I may interrupt 1 second and then I will... Look, that is a code word. I, served in United Nations. And at the critical time in 1974, where the Shah's policy towards Palestinians changed, and that is when the whole rot started. But the point is, that is a code word for the solution of State of Israel. And one state solution or whatever. So if Iran says, if somebody had asked me, if the Iranian foreign minister asked me what formula we will accept, we should say that would be acceptable to the world, I would have said you should say that we accept the 242 resolution, which everybody has been for years wanting 242, which is what you were saying, that the 1967 borders, which of course now has become impossible, but that would be a position that would be very clear. This is again one of those instances where Iran has done more, so that the very extreme radicals will not be happy with Iran saying we will accept what the Palestinians would want, and hasn't done enough, which would make the Israelis and the Westerners happy. This is a very good example of the ineptness of Iranian diplomacy. Sorry, please go ahead.
Well, that's one way of putting it, but the exact opposite can be true also. It's the language, the political language, that it can be helpful in certain ways. But let me get to a much bigger issue, and I think that what Mr. Fatemi mentioned about the no East, no West, that was actually the rhetorics at the beginning, shortly after the revolution in Iran. It was a rhetoric, but what we see now is that they not only try to get that, or maybe through their policies have achieved that, but they're introducing a new idea, and that's the global South that you mentioned. They managed to bring Turkey and Brazil and others into that. So they are in fact introducing an option.
No, I'm sorry. You really need to read the book, if I may be so arrogant. I'm arrogant, but I will say it. The problem is, first of all,
you're an author, you're supposed to say.
No, Global South was not an invention of Iran. If you read the North-South dialogue and so forth, I mean, this is why, because I served almost 5 years in Geneva in UN offices, and the whole North-South dialogue and so on. So Iran has not created these ideas. Nor Iran has created the idea of multipolar world. The multipolar world was first suggested by Primakov. That's why that it's known as the Russian first foreign minister, then later prime minister. Primakov started the multipolar world thing, then the Chinese came to that, then the French, even Jacques Chirac, when he went to China, he talked about multipolar world. Now, a lot of things changed after 9/11. But Iran has not brought this in mind. Shah used to be a most third worldist for the new international economic order. So you are blaming Iran actually for something that they haven't done, while you are giving them a free pass on Palestinians.
Well, the idea of going to the moon wasn't recent, but implementation of it was much more recent.
But the Shah, one of the reasons that the West
was
upset with the Shah was because I was at a meeting taking notes when the Shah was rattling to the Danish prime minister how the third world countries have lost because of inflation in the First World. So one of the things that the West became so upset with Shah was because he was a hawk on the third world issues. Third world, we used to call it, now we say global South.
Well, that's fine. Well, what I'm saying is that they are using it to their benefit, and it is creating the multipolar world that you're talking about. So it's not all rhetorics, it's not just no East, no West, but it's actually they're finding another option. That's the point that I was trying to make.
I know, but the problem is that they haven't found another option, because you cannot create a pole when it doesn't exist. Poles come about, and everybody recognizes them once they have been created.
They're called silent majority.
No, it's not silent majority. A pole is when a country has a combination. International relations, I'm sorry, like everything else, is a discipline. And you have to have the methodology of the discipline to go about it. An international poll develops when a single country or a group of countries have sufficient economic and military resources to be an actor. Why China backed away? Because although China has military and economic power, but it hasn't yet reached a level that could it become actually an international actor all the way. Chinese Navy is still not in the Persian Gulf. It's going to cost China a lot to get to there, or India. So the poles will come about once they have this accumulation of power. And this is what I'm trying to say. So Iran, even if they wanted, if Russia cannot create a pole, the other thing is that in the post-Cold War world, nations' interests have become asymmetrical. Asymmetry means that you can agree on some things, but then on other areas your interest collides. So that, so it is a complex thing, but this is unfortunately that Flynt's and my discipline is not recognized as scientific, and so we get into trouble for that.
All right. Thank you all very, very much for a good discussion, and let's say thanks once again to Shireen Hunter.